It was Max who reacted to the noises more than I did. At first, he was part beagle, part velociraptor, in his mind anyway. He was a full-on bloodhound when a scent or sound caught his attention. I had only lived at the cabin for a few weeks, hoping for some isolation to finish writing the novel I'd been working on for the better part of 5 years. Okay, working on is a bit of an exaggerated way of saying I'd been mentally plotting it out for a good half of a decade. But that's besides the point. Having lived in a fairly bustling apartment building since moving out of my parents' house, it wasn't always easy to stay focused. With noisy neighbors and traffic driving by, that's the very reason I decided to move out to this spot, a good way from the beaten path. Other than some camping trips when I was a kid, I didn't have much experience being surrounded by nature. For the most part, I managed to ignore the sounds of the wind blowing through the branches or the wildlife scurrying around. Max, however, had not been a fan since we moved in. Most days he would just grunt or growl as leaves brushed up against the exterior walls and windows, but he grew so much more erratic when the more deliberate sounding noises began. I don't know if that's the best way to phrase that, but they seem far less random than the soundtrack of the forest. I began to take things a bit more seriously when I was awakened in the middle of the night by my bedroom window cracking from something slamming against it. I practically jumped from my bed, scampering to the window to see what was out there. Max was going completely nuts, barking his furry ass off, with the hair on his back standing upright. He wasn't exactly an intimidating mutt, but the way he growled at the window made me even more unsettled by it. With the moonlight barely cutting through the dense forest, I couldn't make out much of anything, but the spider web split across my window had me a little more than rattled, even with that little voice in my head arguing that it had been nothing more than a tree branch or something tossed by the wind. Throwing on my robe and muttering curses under my breath, I pulled my flashlight and pistol from my nightstand. I leashed Max to ensure he didn't run off, though he was more of a bark as intimidatingly as possible while hiding behind me sort of dog. I flipped on the exterior light hesitantly, creaking open the front door while my faithful companion tucked himself behind my legs, poking his snout between them. Stepping outside, I just stood in the doorway, glancing around the area and guiding my torch from side to side. Sure enough, the wind was quite aggressive, threatening to blow me right back through the entrance given my shaky and still half-asleep legs. With an exhausted chuckle and a wide yawn, I headed back inside, shaking my head at my silliness. Max settled down a bit after taking a look outside, but he still seemed a little on edge. Given that he had been aggressively pulled from his sleep, just like I was, I could only imagine what goes through a dog's mind at such things. I gave him a few treats, leading him back to the bedroom, hopeful that we could both get back to sleep. Before I lay back down, I placed some packaging tape along the cracks in my bedroom window, in hopes of preventing them from getting any worse. I knew I'd have to get it fixed soon enough, but I hoped this would work until I had the motivation to either fix it myself or call the landlord. For the remainder of the night, every tap against the exterior walls as the breeze caught the wind sprang my eyelids back open while Max growled from the floor. I even thought I heard some things rolling around inside the cabin, but I just chalked that up to my sleepy imagination running wild, calm with my growing frustration. The next day, I placed a few calls, arranging to have my split glass replaced, as well as getting some of the trees right next to the house removed. Dale, my landlord, didn't sound exactly thrilled about it, but with me being the third tenant in a little over a year, he couldn't deny that something had to be done. It was at that point when I should have had the sense to ask more questions about those who had moved in and back out so swiftly, but the restless night hadn't left me much sense by morning. I was fighting sleep all day, even while the guys Dale had sent out went to work on the window. It would still be a few days before the tree removal team came back to check things out, but I went ahead and cut down some of the branches right next to the house. The last thing I wanted was to have to arrange to get the damn window replaced again, if that night was as windy as the last. When the noises attempted to interrupt my sleep once more, I ended up choosing to crash on the couch. Yes, I could still hear them from the living room, the scratching at the door and walls, just as much as the tapping on the fresh pane of glass. But with how beat I was by that point, I didn't have nearly as much trouble drifting away, even with Max still occasionally grumbling at the front door. Some days later, as my landlord promised, the tree removal crew arrived. The nights leading up to this had left me both frustrated and exhausted, with the regular scuffling and scraping, but I was hopeful this would do the trick. As it turned out, this was just an evaluation and not the actual removal, but I knew nothing about how these things work. It would be another 2 weeks until they returned to get the job done, but suffice it to say, the lack of fulfilling rest had left me quite on edge. It had escalated to the point in which I was certain there was as much movement inside the house as beyond its walls, with how erratic my mental capacity had grown. Each night I found my eyelids springing back open, due to one slam here or scuffling there, accompanied by growling and barking. I would flip on every light in the cabin, checking closet and cabinet. I walked around the exterior, my flashlight in one hand and my gun in the other, still finding not the slightest trace of what could be causing the constant ruckus. The restlessness had left my paranoia at an all-time high, to the point I was ready to check into a hotel room for a few nights, just to get my mind right. I loved the cabin, and its isolation from the otherwise busy world, but I was certain I'd completely lose my shit if this kept up much longer. Still, I wasn't sure if any hotel would allow Max to stay. I don't have much experience with those things either, and I wasn't about to leave him alone at the cabin for an extended period. Ultimately, I chose to stick it out and hope for the best. I was beyond relieved when the crew arrived to finally get rid of the trees alongside the walls of the cabin. The process didn't take nearly as long as I was expecting, but Max was going apeshit the entire time. After a long day of growling and barking at the door and walls, the little guy passed out before I did. Before I crashed for the night, my body, weary, and my mind cluttered from the weeks of broken sleep, I just stood in the middle of the living room for a time, breathing in the blissful silence. Everything was so wonderfully quiet when I finally flopped onto my bed, my senses fading into the black within seconds. For those first few hours, I experienced the best sleep I had in possibly my entire adult life. That was, of course, until my dog started going completely nuts again, pulled me swiftly back to the world around me. It wasn't rustling or scraping that I heard, aside from the howling Max, but what sounded like moaning of a wounded animal. It was a sound that almost inspired my guts to churn, a garbled, vibrating wail of agony. Again, I peered through my bedroom window, unable to make out anything through the darkness. What I could hear, though, while I attempted to silence my dog to the best of my ability, was what sounded like something being dragged across the ground, possibly only feet beyond the window. Once more I repeated the process that had almost become a nightly ritual at this point, flipping on the exterior lights with my gun, flashlight, and leashed Max. Not only was there only a gentle breeze outside, barely causing the dead leaves scattered across the ground to stir, but it was almost eerily silent. Whether it had been a wounded animal or something else entirely, it would seem that the lights beaming from the cabin inspired it to either run off or hide quietly. Whatever the case, my still growling dog and my nerves being shot from exhaustion, I was honestly feeling quite uneasy at the time. I closed the locked door, leaving the porch light burning brightly, feeling a little more than creeped out. Little voice in the back of my mind begging me not to investigate the area this time. I chose to leave it at that for now. The next day, after managing to toss and turn my way back to sleep for a few more hours at least, I took a look around outside. Under the hopeful safety of the sunlight, I saw no sign of anything having been wounded or dragged across the scattered leaves. There was no indication of anything out of the ordinary, nothing that raised any red flags to me anyway. I didn't exactly spend much time on the small deck, or gazing into the woods, other than to enjoy the occasional blunt to get the creative juices flowing, but nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Regardless of finding no evidence to support my growing paranoia and relentless restlessness, now that's a mouthful, I needed some answers, or at least proof that Max and I weren't collectively going insane. After a quick drive into town to pick up supplies as well as some lunch, I arrived back at the cabin with 2 trail cameras, a new tablet, a case of beer, and a bag load of fast food. Once mine and my faithful companion had filled our grumbling bellies, I got to work setting things up. I mounted the cameras outside, one right in the front of the house, between the front door and my bedroom window, looking out, and the other close to the tree line, aimed back at the cabin. I considered investing in a few more cameras, placing them around each side of the building as well as inside, but I had already forked out more cash than I needed to, in my efforts to set my mind at ease. The sun was going down as I finished setting everything up, accompanied by droplets of rain trickling upon the leaves scattered across the forest floor. It was at that point, as the loud clap of thunder inspired the drizzle to transform into a veritable monsoon, that two things occurred to me. The first was that I didn't even think to check if the cameras were water resistant, and the tutorial videos I looked up didn't get into that aspect of them. But I hope for the best, as they were designed for being out in the elements. Second, something that inspired a grateful sigh, almost releasing the tension in my neck, was that the ambient sounds of the storm would provide the blissful lullaby I so desperately needed. Not only that, but perhaps the rain would at least temporarily halt any late-night shenanigans beyond my bedroom window. With the storm raging on, I felt more relaxed than I had in weeks. While I was mentally and physically exhausted, I couldn't resist taking advantage of the weather. I dug out my baggie of emergency herbal creative juices stimulants, rolled 2 joints, placed 3 chilled beers in my travel cooler, and headed out to the covered rear deck. Max wasn't the biggest fan of thunder, but I left the back door open, just in case he wanted to come out and join me. He had never been one to attempt to run off, but he would often hang out with me in times like these. Well, when it wasn't pouring outside, anyway. Between my head growing blissfully light and foggy, and the glorious soundtrack of the storm, I'm not sure when I nodded off on that lounge chair, nor what time it was when the aggravated barking of my dog pulled my senses back to the world around me. My mind instantly collided with reality while I almost busted my ass as I leaped to my feet. At first, with the back door still being ajar, I was worried that Max had indeed scampered away, but when I sprinted into the house on my still drowsy legs to see him growling and scratching at the front door, I was quite unnerved, to say the least. I couldn't convince him to settle down or back away from the entrance to the cabin, no matter what I tried. I screamed his name, petted the raised fur on his back, and even shook his bag of treats, but he wouldn't budge. After a solid half hour, he began to calm down, but still occasionally grumbled, staring knives at the door. I went ahead and popped open another beer, after bringing the cooler inside and locking up for the night, grabbing my tablet to see if the cameras might have picked up whatever had Max so spooked. Given that the storm was still going strong, not quite as violently as it was when I passed out, but still showing no signs of dwindling, I couldn't make out much of anything from the camera by the tree line. The other one, however, the one looking out from the base of the cabin, appeared to have been completely snuffed out. When I went back through the footage from before it went dark, I felt my already shaky legs attempting to give out from beneath me. Some 20 or 30 minutes before my dog awakened me from my sleep, it looked like some sort of slender, hunched-over figure was outside, steadily approaching the house. All I could see was the darkened outline of the forest in between the stabs of lightning, making it look like an eerie, old stop-motion video, the shadowed figure having moved closer with every flash. With another blink of light, revealing the silhouette only feet from the camera, the next showed only the vacant forest. One final stab of lightning presented me with the last image the camera captured. A pure white, almost translucent, and bloodshot eye, gazing directly into the lens. I swear it felt like it was glaring right through my eyes and into the squishy center of my brain for minutes in that brief flash of light. When the video went completely black, revealing neither the shadowed woods nor whatever peered into the lens, I dropped to the floor, allowing the tablet to slip from my fingers. Max came up beside me, resting his paws on my chest to lick my face, easily reading my shaken state. My mind was reeling, my heart racing with every disturbing scenario that flooded my thoughts. Whatever it was that put an end to the footage clearly had some sort of intelligence, enough to know that it was being watched, anyway. With the bizarre nature of the video, blinking from dark to brief flashes of light, I couldn't tell exactly how it moved. Once I finally got up the nerve to rewatch it, it looked to be somewhat human in its appearance, but its stature was far more primal and animalistic. Perhaps this was not the best scenario for a more imaginative mind, thrusting thoughts of anything from cryptids to wayward aliens against the forefront of my brain, but I knew I had to get a handle on myself. One thing was certain, though. I would not be sleeping again anytime soon. Not in this cabin. Not until I get some answers. Part 2. Once I managed to regulate my breathing and crazy thoughts, I called the police. I wasn't about to investigate this one alone, even with only the sounds of the dwindling storm beyond the walls. Max was still acting uneasy, stealing glances at the door on occasion, but was no longer growling or barking. With it being close to 5 in the morning at this point, the 911 operator seemed reluctant to send anyone out at first, recommending that I wait until sunup. After I described what I saw in the footage, though, he assured me that a squad car would be here within the hour. A good 2 hours later, as the sun began to rise, I heard the car pulling up. Between the rain still coming down quite heavily and the world beyond these walls no longer cloaked in darkness, I was fairly certain that they wouldn't find anything. The officers were friendly enough. While obviously irritated about having to come out here at this hour, they walked around the cabin for a while after I showed them the unsettling footage, but they didn't find anything more than the damaged camera. It looked as though it had been nailed by a baseball bat. The entire casing split in multiple places, and the screen shattered. Officer Grange, the taller and younger of the two, appeared a little unnerved by both the damage to the trail cam and the silhouetted figure on the video. He assured me that there was no trace of anything to worry about in the vicinity of the cabin or any sign of someone attempting to break in. I told him about the unsettling noises over the previous weeks, but he just shrugged those off. He said that a forest at night can produce a wealth of eerie sounds, between the wind and the wildlife, suggesting that I was simply not used to my surroundings yet. Given that I was accustomed to a more populated area, I couldn't deny that he was likely right. But that didn't make me feel any more at ease with my current situation. Once they headed out, certain that whoever had smashed my camera was likely long gone by now, I locked up and fell into my bed. With how exhausted my body and mind were by this point, I passed right out, even with my thoughts still all over the place. The following morning, I made a trip into town to replace the broken camera, along with a small cage to hopefully protect it from further attacks. When I returned to the cabin to find the door open and no trace of Max, I felt my heart practically leap into my throat. I ran inside, barely registering the split wood around where the doorknob used to be, calling out for my dog. Without the slightest whine or moan replying to me, I sprinted back outside, practically screaming the name of my faithful companion. Still nothing, not as much as the rustling of the dry leaves or scampering squirrels. Before I headed back into the cabin trying to figure out if I should call the authorities again, I inspected the one remaining camera, mounted by the tree line. To my surprise, it still had not suffered the same fate as its sibling, and I hoped that it could reveal what went on over my brief trip into town. Fighting to convince my near-spasming fingers to obey my commands as they trembled against the screen of my tablet, I finally managed to cue the most recent footage. I watched on as my truck pulled away, the echoing sounds of Max barking his pleas to not be left alone in the background. With my chaos-fueled thoughts, his bargaining yelps inspired a sensation of guilt, driving a series of nails into my chest. As the video progressed, showing nothing more than the wind stirring the leaves, I managed to regulate my breathing and racing heart, something that didn't last for long. As the barking began to settle down, Max having finally accepted my departure, the next few minutes passed by uneventfully. That was until the barking not only resumed, but grew more frantic than before. It was no longer the hopeless yelps of a dear friend, upset that his roommate had ditched him, but the frenzied and borderline manic howls of anger and fear. It took me a moment to register what was happening as my eyes panned across the screen, but when I focused on the ground, maybe 15 to 20 feet from the patio, where the forest floor appeared to be swelling beneath the leaves, I could almost feel my heartbeat stop cold. I had been pacing back and forth with my device clenched between both hands, but when a slender and bony hand breached the ground like the undead rising from its grave, I found myself stumbling in search of the closest chair. I fell onto the plush, cushioned seat of my recliner, my jaw unhinging at the sight of the skeletal figure as it appeared to be birthed by the dirt and grass. Max was wailing even louder as I inspired words of denial to the imagery before me. Long, matted, and stringy hair fell upon the bony shoulders of the hauntingly slender man as he approached the door, dragging his bare feet across the ground like a pouting child. He was wearing only torn and stained jeans that hung from his scrawny frame as though there were no legs within them. Stopping short only a foot or two from the door, he tilted his head to the ground, his hair peeling away from his shoulders as he hunched over. Crouching down almost to a sitting position, he raised back up with something in his hand, resuming skidding his heels closer to the door. The footage was somewhat grainy, making it difficult to make out what he held, but he raised it above his head. I could see through the shape of the hefty rock before he slammed it down upon the doorknob protruding from the door. Over and over again he crashed the large stone against the doorknob until it tore away from the door, falling to the wooden deck below. He did not enter, only stood before the entryway as it creaked open ever so slightly. With Max barking all the more aggressively, neither the one before nor the one behind the door showed any motivation to pass through. It felt as though there was a silent staring match going on, both participants daring the other to make the first move. When the slender figure began to back away, turning slowly with his head still tilted, revealing only that matted hair and emaciated chest, I tried desperately to release the breath I was holding. He showed no haste in his movements as he returned to the spot from which he had exited the forest floor. Lowering himself to his knees, he leaned over, with his arms outstretched, slowly slithering into the earth, like a creeping snake. I watched on in horror until the ground had swallowed him whole, leaving barely a trace of his arrival. I still gazed on, slack-jawed and trembling, zoned in on that patch of dirt and dead leaves, just waiting for the figure to spring back out. It wasn't the unyielding barks that grew a little louder when I noticed the door to the cabin creaking open, with a curious Max peeking his snout across the threshold. I shouted at my tablet, begging my faithful hound to stay, my heart threatening to tear itself into two. I continued my pointless bargaining as my dog strolled onto the front deck, sniffing the wooden planks in between his barks. He still sounded agitated but more focused on his investigation, edging closer to the spot from which the figure had both appeared and vanished. I knew what was coming as Max stopped in place, brushing the leaves with the tip of his nose. But when that skeletal hand sprang from the earth, snatching him by the collar, a muffled howl was all he was able to let loose before he was pulled into the earth. Momentarily paralyzed by the events I had just witnessed, I just sat there, my flesh spasming from head to toe. Snapping myself back to reality, I jumped to my feet, running to my bedroom to grab my gun, tossing my tablet onto the bed. I pulled it from my nightstand with one hand, dialing 911 with the other. The operator told me to stay put until a squad car would arrive, but my thoughts were so frantic by this point, I had no idea what to do. I just paced back and forth, with a woman on the other end of the line making her best attempts to calm me down. I just about convinced myself to take a seat and wait for the police to arrive when I grew aware of a scuffling sound beyond the splayed open front door. Standing at the entrance to my bedroom, the voice of the operator fading into an echo behind my fear, I backed into the room, closing and locking the door before me. I cut my eyes to the gun in my hand, to the window of my bedroom, and to the tablet. Resting face down on the bed, I picked it up, my violently trembling fingers once more battling to navigate the touchscreen, pulling up the ongoing footage from the trail cam mounted at the tree line. He was just standing there, only feet from the front door again, seemingly glaring at the entrance. I whispered this to the 911 operator while she demanded that I remain in place until the officers arrive, but when I heard the creaking of the boards of the front deck and saw that haunting figure on the screen stalking closer by the second, my rational mind was completely muted by my fear. I dropped my phone as I charged the door to my bedroom, throwing it open to see the pale, wrinkled flesh and skeletal frame standing on the threshold. The stringy gray and muddy hair only parted enough to reveal that pure, white, and bloodshot eye gazing into mine, but that haunting gaze almost froze me in place. As he took one more step, crossing from the outside world to the one within these wooden walls, I snapped out of my paralyzed trance, holding my gun outstretched. "I'll do it," I said, the cold metal shivering in my hand. The man only staggered closer, still gazing into my fracturing mind. "I'll fucking shoot, I swear to..." As his casual saunter transformed into a run charging right at me, I pulled the trigger, with my shuddering extremities almost crippling in fear. I can't honestly say if I meant to fire that bullet into the wall or if my aim was dramatically altered at the time, but when my pistol discharged, the man instantly turned, sprinting back to the door. I ran after him, hoping that I could stop him before he dove back beneath the earth, but he didn't stop. By the time I reached the tree line, my side splitting from the hastened sprint, I could only make out his silhouette, while he darted between the trees ahead. Moments later, while I stood in that same spot, my heart still racing, I heard the sirens drawing closer. Even with my harried thoughts all over the place, I knew it would not be the best idea to greet the officers with a gun in my hand, so I headed back into the cabin to set it down before walking back outside. 2 cars pulled up, one of which contained the 2 officers from before. If nothing else, that saved me from having to explain the entire story again. I did feel a little apprehensive about my having gone against the recommendation of the operator charging out with my gun in hand, but Officer Grange said he would have likely done the same. It was honestly quite impressive how quickly the 4 got to work on investigating the scene. It didn't take them long to uncover the truth behind the man's appearance from beneath the ground either, peeling open the well-camouflaged flap that blended seamlessly with the surrounding terrain. While they would not allow me to descend with them into the underground structure, what they did reveal to me about it may haunt me for the remainder of my days. The 2 who climbed down were pale and shaken when they came back up, one of them retching across the leaves. With the scent emitting from below, my guts almost rebelled as well, so I can only imagine how much more potent it was inside. Without being too descriptive, they told me about the scattered bones, traces of viscera, gore, and human waste all over the sizable structure. The underground dwelling, which was only one wide but well-furnished room, reached under the cabin itself. Though Officer Grange told me there didn't appear to be any trap doors or hidden entrance into the house, it still left me horrified, knowing that the stranger had been right beneath me this whole time. It would appear that this man had been living there for quite some time, feeding off the wildlife he dragged into his domain. They found Max, unconscious but still grasping onto life, my heart breaking as they carried him out. He was in bad shape, with multiple oozing wounds that looked to have been made by human teeth. Did this man devour those poor creatures raw, feasting on their flesh while they still fought to survive? How did he keep them from fighting back while he ate them alive? Would I ever be able to get this imagery out of my head? Within the day, more vehicles showed up, sealing off the area to fully investigate everything. I would have to relocate while this was ongoing, but I was not planning to stay either way. Suffice it to say, I had lost my desire to live out in the middle of nowhere. I'm very happy to report that Max recovered from his many brutal injuries. He has a few limitations, a limp on his right foreleg, and he's not quite as sprightly as he used to be, but I can only imagine how much an experience like this can traumatize an innocent dog. He's slowly coming back to himself, and I make sure to let him know every day how grateful I am that he survived this nightmare. It's been some months since I moved away from that cabin, having relocated to a well-populated suburban street. Yes, I'm still not a fan of being surrounded by people, coming and going, but I find a certain degree of peace in the sounds of garage doors opening, cars driving by, and children playing outdoors. At least I know where those noises are coming from. They never turned up anything on the man who lived beneath the ground just outside that cabin in the woods. They did, however, discover that not all of the bones belonged to animals. I can't help but wonder if the previous residents of that little house did indeed move away, or if they lived out the remainder of their life in that forest after all. Somehow, I have a feeling that, no matter what happened that day, I would have been vacating that cabin one way or another. Yeah, I think I can get used to the life of a suburbanite. Another story from Mr. William Rayne. Big friend of the channel, love that guy. He had his Reddit notifications off, so when I asked him like 2 months ago if I could narrate this story and he didn't respond, I thought I did something to make him hate me, and I felt really bad. And then finally he saw my message and he's like, "Oh man, my bad, sorry." And he seemed really sad about it. So, Will, I still love you. All's well. I have another story from him. I asked for 2 actually. So that one will be read in a couple weeks here. I'm pretty excited about that one too. Always excited to read his stories. He's a great writer, great dude, and I love bringing his work to life. I'm not sure how many dog noises I'm going to do in the story. It probably can get annoying. The dog is barking a lot, and I don't really want, especially a lot of people are listening to this to sleep, so I'm probably going to do 1 or 2 and then call it a day. But yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the story. I'm not sure if there's going to be more, probably not, but I don't know if he handed over all the video evidence to the police. That might have helped a little bit. I'm not sure if whatever that thing was a person in a disguise or if that was an actual monster being. If you guys are very up to date on your cryptid lore, maybe it's a cryptid. Leave it in the comments. But yeah, I'm glad that the dog was okay, and that the owner here is trying to do his best to show the dog that it is loved. So yeah, hopefully the dog gets better and is back to his sprightly self, even if he's limping a little. But yeah, thank you all so much for listening. Hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Ego Volt Anima Vestra.